The dying embers of the campfire cast long shadows across Xander Ellis's weathered face as he stared at the two bundles nestled in his arms, wondering how in God's name he'd ended up responsible for two infants in the unforgiving New Mexico territory of 1876. The smaller one, barely 4 months old, slept against his chest while the older child, perhaps a year and a half, squirmed restlessly on his hip, tiny fingers clutching at his worn leather vest. 3 days ago, Xander had been nothing more than a solitary drifter with a reliable horse and decent aim. Now he was a reluctant guardian to two orphaned babies with no notion of what awaited them at the next town, if they even made it that far. The night was growing colder, and Xander shifted the children closer to his body heat. He'd been riding hard since finding them in that massacre-ravaged wagon. The Comanche raid had left nothing alive except these two little ones, hidden beneath their mother's body. He hadn't been able to leave them there, though the logical part of him knew taking on two infants while traveling through hostile territory was tantamount to suicide. "You two are going to be the death of me," he whispered, his gruff voice softening despite himself when the baby on his chest stirred and made a small mewing sound. Dawn broke with uncomfortable clarity, illuminating the harsh reality of their situation. Xander's supplies were dwindling, especially the goat's milk he'd managed to procure from a farmstead the day before. The older child, a boy with a shock of dark hair, was becoming increasingly fussy, and Xander feared it was only a matter of time before the younger one, a girl with wispy blonde curls, followed suit. Sweetwater Creek was still at least 2 days' ride away, assuming they faced no further complications. Xander grimaced as he mounted his horse, carefully arranging both children. He'd fashioned a crude sling for the infant from his spare shirt, allowing him to keep her secure against his chest while he held the boy with one arm. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Xander stopped beside a shallow stream, allowing his horse to drink, while he tried coaxing some milk into the reluctant mouths of his young charges. The girl took to the improvised feeding cloth eagerly, but the boy turned his head away, red-faced and increasingly distressed. "Come on, little man," Xander pleaded, unaccustomed to the desperate note in his voice. "You need to eat something." A twig snapped behind him. Xander whirled, drawing his colt with a speed that belied his encumbered state. 20 paces away stood a woman, her hands raised in a placating gesture. She wore a simple calico dress, dusty from travel, with a leather satchel slung across her body. "I mean no harm," she called, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "I heard a child crying." Xander kept his pistol trained on her, his eyes narrowing. "Keep your distance, madam." She nodded but took a tentative step forward. "Your son needs something more substantial than milk at his age. I have some mashed beans in my pack that might help." "Not my son," Xander replied automatically. "Not my daughter either. Found them after a raid." Something flickered across the woman's face, understanding perhaps, or sorrow. "My name is Willow Adler. I'm a midwife, traveling to Sweetwater Creek. Please let me help you." Xander hesitated, the boy's cries growing more insistent. Against his better judgment, he lowered his weapon. "Xander Ellis, you make any sudden moves and you'll regret it." Willow approached slowly, her movements deliberate. Up close, Xander could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 25 to his 32 years. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her eyes were a clear, piercing blue that seemed to assess the situation with professional detachment. "How long have you had them?" she asked, reaching carefully into her satchel. 3 days. "Found them hidden under their mother near Winston Pass. Everyone else was dead." Willow's hand stilled momentarily before she pulled out a small tin. "This little one needs solid food. He's old enough for it." She opened the container, revealing a paste of mashed beans mixed with a bit of fat. "May I?" After a moment's consideration, Xander nodded. Willow took the boy from his arm with practiced ease, speaking to him in soothing tones as she perched on a rock by the stream. The child's cries subsided as she offered him a fingerful of the bean mixture. "What were you doing out here alone?" Xander asked, adjusting the infant girl who had fallen asleep against his chest. "I'm not usually alone," Willow replied, not looking up from the child. "I was traveling with a family heading to Sweetwater. Their wagon broke down near Cottonwood Springs, and they decided to wait for repairs. The woman in Sweetwater is due any day now, so I couldn't delay." She glanced up at him. "What about you? Where are you taking them?" Xander shrugged. "Sweetwater's the closest town. Figured I'd find someone there who could take them in." "2 orphans will be a hard sell, even to the charitable sorts," Willow said, her tone matter-of-fact, "especially with winter coming on." "What would you suggest?" Xander's voice had an edge to it. "I'm hardly fit to raise children." Willow studied him for a moment. "You're doing better than you think. This little one is eating now, see." The boy had indeed calmed, eagerly accepting each offering of food. "What have you been calling them?" "Haven't been calling them anything. Didn't seem right to name them when I'm just passing them along." A smile ghosted across Willow's lips. "They need names, Mr. Ellis, even temporary ones." Xander shifted uncomfortably. The mother called out names before she died: Thomas for the boy, Sarah for the girl. I've just been trying to keep them alive. "Thomas and Sarah," Willow repeated softly. "Well, you've done admirably, considering. But they need more than one man can provide on the trail." She hesitated. "I'm heading to Sweetwater anyway. I could travel with you, help with the children." Xander's instinct was to refuse. He worked alone, lived alone, preferred it that way. But the reality of his situation was undeniable. He was out of his depth, and the children's chances of survival would improve significantly with Willow's help. "Fine," he agreed reluctantly. "But we travel at my pace, and you follow my lead if there's trouble." "Agreed," Willow said, her expression brightening. "Do you have another horse, just the one?" "Then I suppose we'll have to share." She stood, Thomas balanced comfortably on her hip. "We should move soon. There's still a few hours of daylight left." By sunset, they had established an uneasy rhythm. Willow rode behind Xander, Thomas secure in her arms, while Xander cradled Sarah against his chest. They spoke little, but Xander found himself appreciating Willow's quiet competence with the children. When they made camp that evening, she took charge of feeding them while Xander hunted a rabbit for their own meal. As the fire crackled between them, and the children slept on a makeshift pallet, Xander studied his unexpected companion. "How does a woman your age end up a traveling midwife in territory like this?" Willow looked up from mending a tear in Thomas's swaddling cloth. "My mother was a midwife in St. Louis. I learned from her. After she died, I found city life too confining." She tied off her thread. "When women out here need help bringing life into the world, they can't always get to a doctor. I go to them instead. Dangerous life for a woman alone. No more dangerous than for anyone else in these parts." She set her sewing aside. "What about you, Mr. Ellis? What's your story?" Xander poked at the fire with a stick. "No story, just a man making his way. A man with a gun on each hip and eyes that scan the horizon even when he's supposedly at rest." Willow raised an eyebrow. "That tells a story of its own." "Not one worth telling," Xander replied curtly. Willow didn't press further. Instead, she said, "We should reach Sweetwater by tomorrow evening if we make good time. The woman I'm going to attend, Martha Greeley, she and her husband run the general store. They might know of families looking to take in children. Xander nodded, though the thought of handing over Thomas and Sarah to strangers created an unexpected tightness in his chest. He told himself it was merely concern for their welfare, nothing more. Morning came with a drizzling rain that soon turned into a downpour. They wrapped the children as best they could, but progress was slow on the increasingly muddy trail. By midday, they were soaked through and Thomas had developed a worrying cough. "We need shelter," Willow said, her voice raised above the storm. "The children can't take much more of this." Xander nodded, scanning the landscape. "There's an old line shack about a mile east. Used to belong to the Crossfire Ranch before they abandoned this section. Might still be standing." They diverted their course, and Xander's memory proved correct. The small wooden structure was weathered but intact, its roof mostly sound except for one corner where water dripped steadily. Inside, it was musty but dry, with an old iron stove that still functioned after Xander cleared a bird's nest from the chimney. Willow immediately set to caring for the children, stripping them of their damp clothes and wrapping them in the driest blankets they had. Thomas's cough worried her, and she brewed a tea from herbs in her satchel, coaxing the child to take small sips. "He needs to stay warm and dry," she told Xander. "We shouldn't travel again until this passes." Xander glanced out the single grimy window at the worsening storm. "Might be a day or more." "Then that's how long we wait," Willow said firmly. As night fell, the wind howled around the small cabin. Xander managed to shoot a grouse that had sought shelter in a nearby thicket, and they roasted it over the stove. The children slept fitfully, Thomas still coughing occasionally. Willow sat beside the makeshift pallet, gently stroking Thomas's back when he stirred. "My mother used to say children are resilient because they haven't yet learned to fear the world," she said softly. "But sometimes I wonder if they simply trust that someone will care for them, no matter what." Xander watched her from his position by the stove. "Is that why you do what you do?" "Care for those who need it," she smiled faintly. "Perhaps, or perhaps I simply never learned to do anything else." She looked up at him. "What will you do after Sweetwater, after we find homes for Thomas and Sarah?" The question caught Xander off guard. He hadn't thought beyond delivering the children safely. "Move on, I suppose. There's always work for a man who knows how to handle himself." "A gunslinger, you mean?" "I prefer security consultant," Xander replied with unexpected humor. "But yes, when necessary." Willow studied him thoughtfully. "You don't strike me as the typical hired gun. There's gentleness in how you handle the children, patience." Xander shifted uncomfortably. "Don't go painting me as something I'm not, Miss Adler. I've done things I'm not proud of." "Haven't we all?" she countered. "It's what we choose to do next that matters." The storm raged through the night and into the following day. They remained in the line shack, establishing a domestic routine that felt strangely natural despite the circumstances. Xander repaired a leak in the roof, while Willow fashioned better swaddling for the babies from material in her pack. Thomas's cough improved with her care, and Sarah began to babble happily when held. By the second evening, the rain had finally stopped, though the trails would still be muddy. They agreed to depart at first light, aiming to reach Sweetwater by nightfall. As they prepared for sleep, Willow handed Sarah to Xander while she attended to Thomas. The infant girl looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, her tiny hand reaching up to pat his stubbled cheek. Something twisted painfully in Xander's chest, as he realized this might be one of the last times he would hold her. In just 3 days, these children had somehow worked their way under his defenses. "She likes you," Willow observed softly. "She doesn't know any better," Xander replied, his voice gruff. Willow's smile was knowing. "Children are excellent judges of character, Mr. Ellis. better than most adults. They set out at dawn, the muddy trail slowing their progress but not stopping it. Xander found himself increasingly aware of Willow's presence behind him on the horse, the warmth of her against his back, the gentle scent of lavender that somehow clung to her, despite days of travel. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and saw Sweetwater Creek spread out below them, a growing settlement with perhaps 40 buildings clustered around a main street, smoke rising from chimneys, and the distant sound of a smith's hammer carrying on the clear air. "We made it," Willow said, relief evident in her voice. Xander felt none of her enthusiasm. Instead, a sense of loss was already settling over him as they guided the horse down toward the town. This journey, unexpected as it had been, was ending. The children would soon be someone else's responsibility, and Willow would be busy with her midwifery duties. They drew curious stares as they rode down the main street, a man with a baby strapped to his chest, a woman behind him holding a toddler. Willow directed him toward a 2-story building with Greeley's General Merchandise painted across the front. A bell jingled as they entered, the store empty except for a heavy-set man stocking shelves. He turned, surprise registering on his face. "Miss Adler, we weren't expecting you for another few days." "The journey was more eventful than anticipated, Mr. Greeley," Willow replied, dismounting carefully with Thomas. "How is Martha? The baby's taking its time. Doc Wilson's been by twice, says it could be any day now." His gaze shifted to Xander and the children. "I see you've brought company." Willow quickly explained the situation while Xander stood awkwardly by the door, Sarah still secured against his chest. Mr. Greeley's expression grew somber as he heard of the raid and the orphaned children. "Martha will want to help, of course, but with the baby coming." He shook his head. "Times are hard for everyone. Finding homes for 2 little ones won't be easy." "We understand," Willow said. "For now, we just need a place to stay while we figure things out." Mr. Greeley directed them to the boarding house across the street, run by a widow named Mrs. Thornton. "Tell her I sent you. She's got a soft heart for children." The boarding house was a well-maintained 2-story building with a small garden out front. Mrs. Thornton, a plump woman with silver-streaked hair, listened to their story with growing concern. "Oh, the poor dears," she said, looking at the children with sympathy. "Of course I have rooms. Not many travelers this time of year." She eyed Xander and Willow speculatively. "Will you be needing 1 room or 2? 2, they answered simultaneously, then exchanged glances. 2 rooms, Willow confirmed. "And perhaps some clean clothing for the children. We can pay." Mrs. Thornton waved away the offer. "I've kept my grandson's baby things. He's 5 now, but I never could bring myself to part with them. You're welcome to whatever fits." She showed them to adjacent rooms on the 2nd floor, promising hot water for bathing and a proper meal in an hour. Left alone with Sarah while Willow took Thomas to get cleaned up, Xander felt a strange hollowness growing inside him. This comfortable boarding house marked the end of their journey together, both with the children and with Willow. The next morning, Willow was called away to attend to Martha Greeley, whose labor had finally begun. Xander found himself solely responsible for the children again, but in the more forgiving environment of the boarding house. Mrs. Thornton proved an invaluable ally, showing him how to properly change the babies and preparing appropriate food for Thomas. "You're doing remarkably well for a man with no experience," she observed as Xander successfully fed Sarah without spilling a drop of milk. "Had a good teacher," he replied, thinking of Willow's patient instructions. Mrs. Thornton smiled knowingly. "Miss Adler is quite something, isn't she? Not many women would brave the territories alone as she does." "She's capable," Xander agreed, trying to sound neutral. "And pretty too, Mrs. Thornton added with a hint of mischief. "If you don't mind my saying so." Xander didn't respond, but he couldn't deny that Willow's absence left the day feeling somehow dimmer. He spent the hours caring for the children and walking the town, asking discreetly about families who might be willing to take in orphans. The responses were not encouraging. Most households were already struggling to feed their own. Willow returned late that evening, exhausted but smiling. "A boy," she announced as she entered the boarding house parlor where Xander sat with the sleeping children. 8 pounds and healthy as can be. "Congratulations," Xander said, genuinely pleased for her success. "You must be tired." "Exhausted," she admitted, sinking into the chair opposite him. "But it's a good tiredness." She glanced at Thomas and Sarah. "How were they today?" "Good as gold," Xander replied, surprising himself with the pride in his voice. "Thomas is walking more steadily now that he has some space to practice." Willow smiled, her face softening in a way that made Xander's chest tighten. "They're remarkable children. Have you had any luck finding homes for them?" The question brought reality crashing back. "Not yet. Most folks are barely getting by themselves." Willow nodded, her expression turning thoughtful. "I spoke with Martha while I was there. She suggested we might try the settlement at Red Rock Canyon. There's a growing community there, including some families from back east with more resources." "Red Rock's at least 3 days' ride," Xander pointed out. "Yes," Willow agreed. "I told Martha I'd need to discuss it with you first." The implication that they were making decisions together as a unit wasn't lost on Xander. Nor was the fact that Willow seemed to be assuming they would continue their journey together. "You don't have obligations here?" he asked cautiously. "Martha will recover well enough with her mother's help, and there are no other women close to their time." Willow met his gaze steadily. "Unless you'd prefer to continue alone," Xander looked down at the sleeping children. "No," he said quietly. "I think they do better with both of us." They departed for Red Rock Canyon 2 days later, better equipped this time. Mrs. Thornton had given them proper clothing for the children, and Mr. Greeley had sold them a second horse at a generous discount, allowing them to travel more comfortably. Xander still carried Sarah in a sling against his chest, while Thomas alternated between riding with him and with Willow. The journey was easier than before the weather held fair, and the children had grown accustomed to travel. In the evenings around the campfire, Xander found himself opening up to Willow in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, his time scouting for the Army during the war, and the years after when he'd drifted from job to job, never settling. In return, Willow shared stories of her apprenticeship with her mother, the difficult decision to leave St. Louis after her death, and her experiences bringing new life into the world under sometimes harrowing conditions. "Have you ever thought of settling down?" Xander asked on their second night out from Sweetwater. "Finding a place to establish a permanent practice." Willow gazed into the fire. "Sometimes, but there's such need out here, women in remote homesteads who would have no one otherwise." She looked up at him. "What about you? Ever thought about hanging up your guns?" The question hit closer to home than she could know. In truth, Xander had been contemplating exactly that over the past few days. The life he'd been living suddenly seemed empty compared to the purpose he'd found caring for Thomas and Sarah. "Been thinking on it," he admitted. "Man can't live forever with his finger on a trigger." Something shifted in Willow's expression, a softening perhaps, or a flicker of hope. "What would you do instead?" "Don't rightly know," Xander said. "Ranching, maybe. I know horses." He glanced at the sleeping children. "Something more suitable for raising a family anyhow." The words hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Willow didn't respond directly, but her smile told Xander she understood what he was considering. They reached Red Rock Canyon on the afternoon of the third day. The settlement was newer than Sweetwater but growing rapidly, with several substantial buildings and even a small church. They found rooms at the local hotel, a two-story structure that boasted actual glass windows and painted walls. The following morning, they set about inquiring after potential homes for Thomas and Sarah. The responses here were more encouraging. The community was more prosperous, with several established families. By midday, they had two possibilities: the childless wife of the bank manager who had always wanted children, and a rancher's family with 4 boys who had been hoping for a daughter. They both seemed like good options, Willow said as they sat on a bench outside the hotel, watching Thomas toddle unsteadily around their feet while Sarah napped in Xander's arms. The Parkers have a lovely home in town, and Mrs. Parker clearly adored Thomas. And the Hendersons have a good spread, Xander added. Stable situation, other children for company. Yet despite the promising prospects, neither of them seemed eager to make a decision. They sat in silence, watching Thomas pick up a leaf and offer it solemnly to Willow. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, accepting the gift with the gravity it deserved. She looked up at Xander, a question in her eyes that she seemed afraid to voice. "Feels wrong splitting them up," Xander said finally. "They've already lost their parents. They should at least have each other." "Yes," Willow agreed quickly. "I was thinking the same thing." Another silence fell between them, heavier this time. Xander stared down at Sarah's sleeping face, her tiny hand curled around one of his fingers even in sleep. The thought of never seeing her or Thomas again created a physical ache in his chest. "Xander," Willow began hesitantly. What if she was interrupted by a commotion down the street? A man was riding hard into town, his horse lathered and his face grim. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, shouting for attention. Raiders, coming up from the South Valley. 20, maybe 30 men. The effect was immediate. Men rushed for weapons, women hurried children indoors, and the church bell began to ring in alarm. Xander was on his feet in an instant, handing Sarah to Willow. "Get inside," he ordered. "Stay away from windows." "What are you going to do?" Willow demanded, gathering Thomas to her side. "What I know how to do," Xander replied grimly, checking his revolvers. "Help defend the town." "Xander," Willow began, but he cut her off. "I'll come back for you, all of you. I promise." The next hours passed in a blur of organization and preparation. The raiders, a mixed band of outlaws who had been terrorizing isolated homesteads, were still an hour out. The town had just enough time to establish defenses. Xander, whose experience was immediately recognized by the local sheriff, found himself helping position men and coordinate their efforts. From the hotel window, Willow watched with growing anxiety as barricades went up and armed men took positions. She held the children close, singing softly to keep them calm despite her own fear. When the first shots rang out, she flinched but continued her song, moving away from the window as Xander had instructed. The attack, when it came, was chaotic and brutal. The raiders had expected an easy target but found a prepared defense instead. Gunfire echoed through the streets for what seemed like hours, though in reality the fighting lasted less than 30 minutes before the attackers broke and fled, leaving several of their number behind. When silence finally fell, Willow could bear the waiting no longer. With Sarah secured in her sling and Thomas on her hip, she made her way cautiously downstairs. The hotel lobby was filled with townspeople emerging from hiding, exchanging news and checking on neighbors. "The raiders are gone," someone reported. "Sheriff says we beat them back good. 2 of our men wounded, but they'll live." Willow pushed through the crowd, stepping out onto the porch. The street was a mess of overturned wagons and scattered debris from the barricades. Men were emerging from their defensive positions, some helping the wounded toward the doctor's office. She scanned anxiously for Xander, her heart pounding. Then she saw him walking toward the hotel with a slight limp but otherwise unharmed. Relief flooded through her with such intensity that her knees nearly buckled. Xander saw her at the same moment. Something in his expression shifted, softened, and he quickened his pace despite his limp. He reached the hotel steps and paused, looking up at Willow with the children in her arms. "Everyone all right?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. "We're fine," Willow assured him. "Are you hurt?" "Just a graze," he dismissed. "The raiders won't be back. We dealt with them decisively." Willow nodded, sudden tears stinging her eyes. The realization of how easily she could have lost him, how close this new, unexpected family had come to being shattered, hit her with physical force. "I thought," she began, her voice breaking. Xander climbed the steps and stood before her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I promised I'd come back," he said softly. "Xander," Willow said, gathering her courage. "Before, when we were talking about the children, I was going to ask, what if we didn't have to find them another home? What if they already have one? With us?" The hope that blazed across Xander's face told her everything she needed to know. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "Ever since Sweetwater. I just didn't know if it was something you'd want." "It is," Willow said simply. "More than anything." Thomas chose that moment to reach for Xander, small arms outstretched in silent demand. With practiced ease, Xander took him, settling the boy on his hip while Sarah remained snug against Willow's chest. They stood there on the hotel porch, looking for all the world like the family they had already become. "People will talk," Xander pointed out, though his expression suggested he didn't particularly care. "A gunslinger and a midwife, taking in orphans without being married." "Then we'll get married," Willow replied pragmatically. "Unless that's not what you want." Xander laughed, the sound startling several nearby townspeople. "Willow Adler, that's the most unromantic proposal I've ever heard." "I'm a practical woman, Mr. Ellis," she retorted, a smile tugging at her lips. "But if it's romance you want—" She stepped closer until they were almost touching, the children between them. "I've fallen in love with you, Xander, watching you with these children, seeing your gentleness and your strength. I don't want to imagine a life without you in it." Xander's free hand reached up to cup her cheek. "I love you too," he said simply. "You and these little ones. Never thought I'd find a family out here, but here you are." As the sun set over Red Rock Canyon, Xander stood with one baby on his hip, another in his arms, having traded with Willow to give her a rest. The children were peaceful now, the day's excitement giving way to drowsiness. Willow leaned against him, her head on his shoulder as they watched the golden light fade from the distant mesas. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, reaching up to touch his weather-worn face. "None of us are." Xander turned his head to kiss her palm, a promise in the gesture. "No," he agreed softly, "we're not alone, not anymore." In the fading light, with Thomas on his hip and Sarah in his arms, Xander found himself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in years, the first day of their new life together.